communities in a bigger and more direct way. But then the question is, what's happening in these educational spaces? And the answer is yes, education. People are learning things. So the two sites I worked on were a women's ESL class, which you can see a photo of it here on the slide. That was my co-teacher who's standing up at the front of the classroom there. And then the other program I worked on was a children's summer camp. And both of those were spaces where people were able to make real learning gains in terms of improving their spoken English for the women in the ESL class, or in terms of having somewhere kind of safe and supportive to be during the summer for the kids. And so both of these were great programs that accomplished that goal. But I want to talk about the other goal that they accomplished. And the note I have up there is educational programs as sites of community building, political socialization, and identity making. And I think these are really important things that educational programs can do. Because what happens in the space of an educational program is that people talk to each other. In fact, people are supposed to express things about themselves. They are supposed to put forth new ideas and test them with others. Educational spaces are spaces of ongoing discourse and dialogue. And so they become places where people can talk and express and present themselves. And this is particularly important for immigrant communities because they are being put together out of a set of individuals who didn't previously have relationships with each other and who are coming to a new place and are trying to make new identities. In order for any of us to be social actors and political actors, we need to have relevant, useful, contextual identities that we can use to operate socially. We need to understand how we relate to others, who is like us and who is unlike us, because it's through those sorts of exchanges that allow us to be members of a community. And when you're a new immigrant somewhere, you don't necessarily have those to start out, right? And the rules you had of who you were and how you related to others that made sense in your place of origin may not make sense in your new place. And so what you need to do is figure out who you are now, who you are in this place. And you need to be able to develop those relationships. And that's the work that happened in these community educational programs because this ongoing dialogue was happening. So I found that the women who I taught were very eager to talk about how America was different from back home, how culture and practices were different. But what I found is that they spent a lot of that time forming relationships among each other and understanding themselves as a single group. And I'm going to give you a change to look at my face for a minute. And so what they found is instead of relating to themselves as all different, these are women from all over the Arab world. There were Palestinians, Jordanians, Egyptians, Yemeni. They came from different class backgrounds. They came from different educational backgrounds. They didn't have a lot in common at that kind of basic level, right? And they wouldn't necessarily have said that they belonged to the same sorts of groups if you'd asked them before immigration. But once they were all together living in Brooklyn, they had to work together to form an identity that could include all of them, to form a collective Arab American identity. That was something that could give them strength and comfort in their new place. And the class gave that an opportunity to happen. And that's where people came together and formed a common identity in a way that they could use going forward, which was really useful. And they did it through all sorts of things, through talking about back home, right? None of them said what countries they were from when they were talking about back home. It was all just back home, right? Which kind of emphasized the space. Through distinguishing between my religion or the American culture and their culture, right? So making that kind of binary distinction that helped them understand differences. And also through kind of just generally sharing of cultural practices. There was this wonderful moment where the Yemeni women brought in a Yemeni meal for us to share during class. And the other women in the class, kind of all of it was unfamiliar to them because ghasid is not a food that's eaten much outside of Yemen. But for them, it was all like, oh, we understand this practice, and it became a place of cultural sharing. And similarly for the kids, they found that they were able to be both Arab and American in kind of whole and meaningful ways during their time in the program. And so in these spaces, and in particularly in these more informal educational spaces that didn't have strict curriculum and the sets of things to get through, but that were designated as spaces where you were meant to be learning and testing and exploring and thinking, people found that they were places where there could be a clear way for them to start articulating a new identity. And that those new identities were the foundations that were then able to lead them into greater integration in community life and greater integration into the political life of their new home. And so educational spaces, even these most informal ones, even the ones where you're really not sure what's happening curriculum-wise, right? By making these spaces, making them open, making them spaces of dialogue, you can do a real service to a community in letting it form itself and move forward. So moving on to my next point, I want to talk a little bit about the work I'm doing right now in Lebanon. The need to work and talk and think about responses to the Syrian crisis, and in particularly the massive refugee movements that are almost unparalleled, and that are something that we haven't dealt with as an international community. There's a need to do something, right? And so I think we all feel that need to do something. And I got involved in this project, and kind of one of the questions that has always mattered for me is, why is education the right way to do this? And in some ways, I think I'm particularly interested in education-based interventions into the Syrian crisis because I'm an educator, right? Because I'm a university teacher, and I think education matters, and I think it transforms people's lives and potentials, right? But at the same time, I think choosing to do an educational intervention matters in response to the Syrian crisis, because we can see that there are particular utilities that educational approaches can give in order to be able to really make a change and try to support positive social change to come out of such a horrendous crisis. So I'm going to bring back up my slides. The particular project I'm working on is focused in Lebanon. And Lebanon, along with Turkey, has really borne the brunt of the neighboring countries of Syria in terms of refugee arrivals, to say nothing of the destruction that's happened inside Syria. And the situation in Lebanon today is that 1 in 3 people in Lebanon is either a Syrian or a Palestinian refugee. That's been approximately 1.5 million new arrivals in a country of 4 million prior. So basically a huge, huge increase in people arriving. And it's absolutely changed the social landscape. Whereas there had always been migration and circulation between these two countries, in the context of the current crisis, it's escalated to a huge extent. And I have to say, all parties are not prepared to manage it. There are big issues of infrastructure and of kind of social capacity and economic stability that are making this fundamentally welcoming act of letting in so many people who are fleeing violence and in search of a safe place to be, but it's caused massive trickle-down effects to the entirety of Lebanese society. And it's particularly an issue because refugees are barred from most legal employment. They face a high cost of living, and they face high barriers to all sorts of education. And so given the map that I've got up there, I actually don't think it's a terribly communicative map, because what it shows is that the entire country is red being the most dense refugees. I think it kind of shows the fact that people are out of ideas about how to color, about how to make a map about this. So the question for us is about, why is higher education the right answer? And some of this is about the fact that that Syrian refugee populations are already fairly well educated, and so higher education is what's available. But it's also because higher education leads people to be able to really make some significant changes in their lives. It helps people move forward and credential themselves for career purposes. And so That's one side of the equation, right? Is why we should engage in higher education. But then the other side of the equation is why are we teaching about community mobilization? And the reason for that is that there's strong civil society in Lebanon, and whereas the Syrian civil society was more suppressed, at the same time, there was the voluntary sector that people were engaged in. So there was a lot of people who want to do this sort of community work. And as along with social traditions of mutual care and charity. And so what it struck us is that people wanted to be able to help their communities. People wanted to be able to start projects in this new context and really break down and do something new. But at the same time, they didn't have the tools for it. They didn't have material resources, and they didn't have conceptual resources for working in this new space. And so what we settled on in developing this program is one that would do two things. One is it would meet the need for education by helping people earn transferable credits so they could work on a university education, which we know is really important to personal outcomes. And that also we'd create organizers who would be able to go out and work in communities and make changes. And that's really what we wanted to do. And so we think that this project is going to make changes in a couple of areas. We think it will help deal with some of the problems having to do with access to legal work for refugees. We think having a mixed student population of Syrians, Palestinians, Lebanese, and others will help build community contacts among different communities and help people work together. We think that we can, in a small project like this, be kind of flexible about people missing papers, which is a major issue. And we also think that we can address some of the other access issues through particular interventions. This project is still under development. We haven't launched it yet, and it's a big undertaking, but I think at the same time, we need to think largely and creatively if we're working on refugee issues about what education can do and why it is able to make changes. And so what I think the CMIC project does that is so important is that it is able to take these ideas about why education can make a difference and why education in this area can make a difference and can put them into practice. And that's what I'm really excited and looking forward to in this. So I want to thank you all for listening. I know I've slightly overrun my time, for which I apologize. But I'm looking forward to hearing your questions. And I've also sent some documents to the QED staff that they'll be sharing on their website. So if you want to learn any more about my research, please feel free to contact me outside of this. And you can read the other things I've written. Okay, thank you. And I'll turn it back over to Nadia for the Q&A.
Thank you, Emily, for that excellent presentation. I wanted to make the link between the project that you described in Lebanon and transnationally, right? It's a project that's beyond Lebanon. It's based in Canada, it runs internationally, and the foundation. So I would add that the foundation, the Al-Qazzaz Foundation for Education and Development, is a partner in that project and a contributor, and may launch that material online and may be instrumental in being able to promote it and to disseminate it very widely internationally. Are there any questions? This is going out to all of those listening at the moment. Are there any questions? I'll start with a question, but I'm waiting for questions. So as soon as I see one come up in the chat, I'll pose it to you, Emily. Emily, I have a question about education. It's very interesting to hear a university professor say, well, you know, the education can take the back burner. It's about building the community. And I imagine that's a hard lesson to learn for, you know, being an educator. What brought that lesson home for you, and how do you see community building? Maybe you can give me an example of someone you know where community building has actually helped them more than whatever certificate they walk out with or whatever learning even that they've walked out with.
Yeah, it was a backwards lesson to learn, definitely. And it's one that was actually brought home to me when I was doing my fieldwork, because I saw that when personal connections were lost with people who were leaving programs or deciding to continue on somewhere else, that when they lost that personal connection, that interest in continuing to learn dissipated. right? And so, in fact, the English program I taught in, lost a whole bunch of its students at one point because the teacher left, right? And I was supposed to take over his class, and I showed up the next week and nobody was there, right? Like literally no one showed up to the class because he left, and like even though they knew me, they were all like, why are we staying with you? Like, we'd rather work with him, and since he's leaving, we'll go find something else now, right? And so that idea that people coming together and being in community was more important than, oh, I might continue to learn English, right? Like that
Yes.
I can learn English anywhere, right? I need this community building space.
Right.
And so I think that's part of it. The other thing I can say is that if we think about what educational institutions do, they give you information, right? And so they teach you things. And so I certainly hope all my students leave my classes knowing things, right? But the other thing they give you is a network and a connection. And I think this is really clear to me in Ottawa, right? As a relative newcomer to Ottawa, that my students study political science in Ottawa because of their ability to then be networked into the political scene in Ottawa, right? And so that's really important to them. And that the content of what they learn matters, but so does that network, right? And I think it also, like, I attended a couple of elite institutions in my time, and nobody goes to Yale for the education. I mean, we do go to Yale for the education, right? But we go to Yale to know people who went to Yale, right? Like, that's part of its function. And I think if you focus on those social functions of education, it doesn't do anything to diminish the importance of what you teach and how you teach it. But what it does do is make you very realistic about it. And so I think all of us need to be really realistic about the fact that we're building people not just as fact-knowing machines, but we're building people who are participants in life. And we need to make sure that people have those skills and get that set of frameworks that help them set them up for their futures.
Right. We have another 5 minutes for questions and answers, and I see a question come up already that I'll pose to you, Emily, and just wanted to say that an image came up very briefly. That's of Bayan Al-Khatib, who will be closing the webinar and who will be describing a little bit about future webinars and how we can all stay in touch, all those who are listening today and all those who are listening to this webinar in the future. So back to you, Emily. My question, or a question that's come up from the audience here, is where do you see education technology in all of this? And of course, I imagine you know that I'm not just talking about the clickers that people press buttons on in the middle of a lecture, but the technology that allows you, for example, to be teaching in Lebanon from Canada.